There's plenty in this world that cannot be explained, mysterious creatures that have never been identified, experiences shared by countless people, and disappearances that seem to deny the laws of physics. These strange paranormal mysteries are currently unsolved and unanswerable. Number 5. Werewolves and werewolf-like creatures date back to antiquity, but it was in the Middle Ages that what we think of as werewolves really began to take shape. That occurred nowhere more strongly than it did in Germany, so it would be fitting that the supposedly last werewolf met its end in the Germanic lands. The story of the Moorbach monster dates back to the early 1800s, at a time when belief in the likes of witches and werewolves was finally beginning to fade. For the past 200 years, there had been a real fear of werewolves in Germany and the surrounding areas. The panic had begun around 1589, when Peter Stump confessed to being a werewolf and taking the lives of 18 people. Accused werewolves were put on trials similar to the more famous witch trials. Werewolves were usually people who had been cursed due to some horrific act, or people who had passed away while committing some terrible sin. By the 1800s, those fears had mostly subsided, but there were still some that believed the terrifying creatures existed. At the time, there were more very real threats to deal with. The Napoleonic Wars had swept through Europe, changing the continent forever. It was a soldier fleeing one of these conflicts that became the Moorbach monster. That year, Napoleon launched his invasion of Russia. The assault went terribly, and the army was forced to turn back. As both Russia and the Russian weather chased after the fleeing French army, countless lost their lives due to the awful weather conditions. Many soldiers on both sides deserted, including a man named Thomas Schweitzer. Schweitzer was a French soldier from the area of Alsace. He had seen horrific things during his time as a soldier, and had been part of the attack that had razed Moscow to the ground before the army was turned back around to trudge through the snow to a safer location for winter. During that time, he would have watched countless soldiers lose their lives and have to be left behind. It's little wonder why Schweitzer would decide to abandon the army. He was making his way back home with a group of Russian soldiers who had also deserted. As they went, they would steal from homesteads that they passed in order to survive. The group came across a small hamlet called Wittlich and what looked like an empty farmhouse. After breaking into the farmhouse, they realized it wasn't empty at all. Schweitzer attacked and took the life of the farmer. The act was witnessed by the farmer's wife, who cursed Schweitzer. According to the legend, the woman declared that from now on, at each full moon, you'll turn into a rabid wolf so that others may see the monster you've become. Schweitzer then took the life of the woman too. Her curse would come true though, and every month Schweitzer would become a horrifying creature. Even when in his human form, he seemed to be more violent than the other deserters he traveled with. They abandoned him, and he took up with the highwaymen and other criminals, but even they found Schweitzer to be too much. He became a loner, living in the woods and terrorizing the surrounding villages. That continued until Schweitzer was finally hunted down by some villagers that he terrorized. He was in human form when he was attacked and lost his life. He was buried beneath a crossroads in Wittlich, which is today Moorbach. To make sure he was never able to return, a shrine to St. Mary was built on top of his grave. The shrine features a candle, which must always be lit. According to legend, if the candle goes out, the Moorbach monster will be able to return. For over a century, the candle remained lit, and the monster faded into folklore. But in the aftermath of the Second World War, the Moorbach monster made its return. After the partition of Germany, US soldiers were stationed at military bases around the western half of the country. Among those was the Hahn Air Force Base, which is described as a frontline NATO facility during the Cold War. It's roughly located 11 miles away from Moorbach. In 1988, soldiers were making their way to the base, traveling through Moorbach, when they noticed that the candle at the shrine had been extinguished. They didn't understand the importance of the shrine, so they carried on walking, paying it no attention. Later that night, the automated alarms at the base would go off, indicating that someone or something was trying to get in. Guards spotted a wolf-like creature standing on its hind legs. It was between 8 and 9 feet tall. After taking only a few steps, it was able to jump over a fence roughly 12 feet high and escape into the night. Soldiers couldn't explain what they had seen, but they knew they couldn't let whatever it was escape. A tracking dog was brought to the site where the creature was last seen, but it became terrified and refused to go after it. According to some sources, the dog had to be retired not long after. Some sources claim there were multiple incidents of a creature that terrified both the soldiers and their dogs being spotted at Hahn Air Force Base. The creature was spotted by others too, lurking in the woods and waiting to attack again after lying dormant for over 100 years. The officers later heard about the legend of the Moorbach monster and relit the candle at St. Mary's Shrine. After that point, sightings of the werewolf stopped, and it seemed like the Moorbach monster had been defeated again. What exactly the soldiers witnessed remains a mystery. Brown bears are currently extinct in Germany, though it's interesting to note that the bears went extinct in the early 1800s. It might have been possible for the Moorbach monster to have been a bear during the original legend, but not in 1988. Some have suggested that the monster's title as the last werewolf was meant symbolically, that it came at the end of the werewolf pandemic. That also wouldn't explain how it came back all these years later. Strangely, there are multiple cases of soldiers, especially soldiers in a foreign country, spotting creatures that cannot be explained by conventional means. Whatever was seen at Hahn, the legend of the Moorbach monster continued to be told by soldiers on the base until the military left the base in 1993. Number 4. When Liz and Bill Rich moved into an old cottage on the outskirts of Brecon Beacons, they were ready to start their lives as a married couple together. The first summer of their life in the isolated location was great, but things started to go downhill into a scary unsolved mystery. The young couple moved into Hill Finag in 1989, with Bill's son from a previous relationship. They had been looking for a place to rent in the area for months before they found the property. It was an isolated cottage that had been built on the site of an even older farmhouse, with the mountains making a beautiful backdrop. Bill was a painter, and the location was definitely inspiring. The couple got a good rent price and moved in. Things started well, and the couple began to raise livestock in the land, and Bill's art business took off. He seemed to be the next big thing in the art world, and was selling paintings almost as quickly as he could paint them. They were mostly cheerful images of animals. There was no sign that anything strange was going to happen. After the first summer, work began to slow down for Bill. That wasn't too concerning, but in hindsight, it was the first step into a very strange world for the Rich family. Then the footsteps started. Bill was the first one to hear the footsteps. Not long after they'd moved into the property, Liz gave birth to a baby boy named Ben. One night, Liz got up to feed Ben like usual, and Bill went downstairs to use the bathroom. While downstairs, he heard the sound of heavy footsteps walking across the hallway upstairs. They didn't sound like Liz, and Bill rushed upstairs, thinking there was some kind of intruder. Liz was still in the baby's room. Bill's other son was still fast asleep, and there was no sign of any intruder. It would be easy to explain away the incident as an old house settling, or Bill imagining things while still half asleep. Less easy to explain was the electricity bill that the couple received at the end of the quarter. The bill for the past 3 months amounted to £750, roughly £2,000 in today's money, and 4 times the expected amount. It wasn't something that could be explained by the lights being kept on. Bill contacted the electricity provider, figuring that either there had been some sort of mistake or somebody was stealing electricity from them. The provider insisted it wasn't possible that anyone had tapped into their electricity, and there was no mistake. A technician was sent around to look at the meter that registered their usage. Even when all the electronics in the property were switched off, the meter continued to go up. The following month, a bill for £500 came. Neither the Riches nor the electricity company could explain what was going on. Meanwhile, the paranormal activity was beginning to accelerate inside the house. Both Liz and Bill heard the footsteps now. They were heavy and would often come down the stairs, though never reach the bottom. Liz also saw strange flashing lights, especially from the old barn on the property, even when the electricity was switched off. She figured that whatever had been using the electricity was focused on the barn. Liz was the first person to spot one of the apparitions. As she was walking towards the house, she spotted an old woman in an upstairs window. As she watched the woman, the specter disappeared into thin air. Ben and his little sister also remembered seeing the woman, who would often watch them while they were in their playroom. The ghost didn't hurt anybody, but she didn't seem like a kind elderly lady. The family got a menacing vibe from her. Even the animals on the property weren't immune to the strange activity. Many of the farm animals would pass away without warning. The beloved family pig started behaving very strangely, running around the house and acting odd. The family could not explain what was going on, and neighbors suggested that they go to a priest, and willing to try anything at that point, they did just that. Multiple priests came to the house to bless and exorcise it. Sometimes the activity would fade away for a while, only to return even stronger than before. Paranormal experts from around the country and abroad descended on Finag. There were many different spirits put forward as being behind the mysterious activity. The couple was featured in a 1996 newspaper article and recalled some of the more absurd claims by the experts. One claimed that Bill was being attacked by the relatives of a 16th century alchemist whose life he took in a past life. Another said that Bill had been chosen by the Antichrist to direct evil spirits during the end of the world. Others were more conventional, like the victim of an unsolved crime that had been buried somewhere on the property, decades or centuries earlier. In the end, the riches grew frustrated and asked for no more paranormal investigators to come. Perhaps most frustrating of all was that none could stop what was happening. One thing most experts agreed on was that it wasn't just one entity haunting the house. There may have been as many as 4. The old woman was determined to be the mother of the cottage's owner, who passed away on the property years earlier. It was believed there were 2 other male spirits and a 4th demonic entity attached to Bill himself. The demonic entity made itself known to the Riches multiple times. On one occasion, the 7-foot dark figure was stood menacingly at the end of their bed. Liz would sometimes see the figure darting across the kitchen. Even someone from outside the family saw the strange figure. A man camping in the fields at the back of the house spotted the silhouette of a large man in the window, while both Liz and Bill claimed they were asleep. The fact that this entity was attached to Bill seemed apparent. Liz turned to the church for support as they tried to get to the bottom of the mystery, but Bill threw himself into his work. His paintings took on darker themes, reflecting what it was like to live in this haunted house. He became more and more focused on the art and more distant from his family. Liz and Bill had wanted to move out early on, but found that they couldn't afford to move anywhere. Over the next few years, Liz would occasionally take the children and move in with their parents, just to get away from whatever it was that clearly didn't want them in the house. On one occasion, Liz returned to the house to find Bill seemingly possessed, whispering about bodies walking through the house. That was the final straw for her, and she demanded that they all leave the property for good. That would be the end of their ordeal, but they were never able to get to the bottom of what happened. Bill and Liz separated not long after, and Bill passed away without finding an explanation. Some claim that Bill had gotten involved in a dark art society when he was younger and started a ritual, but abandoned it halfway through. The being he summoned was then attached to him. Others believe it was simply the isolated house, perhaps with a natural downturn in business and the 2 young children causing stress on the family. That wouldn't explain the bizarre electricity bills, though. The electricity company couldn't find any problem with the meter, and according to a 1996 report, the company agreed to not push for payment, though later articles claimed that the electricity was eventually cut off due to a lack of payment, and Bill was left alone in the dark with his paintings and the mysterious entity. Number 3. Some places in the world seem to be more interconnected to other worlds. They exist as portals between this world and a parallel universe, or even the spirit world. The Sai-Kung Peninsula in Hong Kong is said to be one of those places. Much of Hong Kong is made up of various country parks with beautiful scenery and well-marked hiking routes. The Sai-Kung Peninsula is no different, with the Sai-Kung East and West parks encompassing most of the peninsula. For decades, the parks have been popular hiking spots, especially for the Maclehose Trail. The trails are well-established routes, and while there are more difficult sections, many are accessible even to beginner hikers. Efforts were made to make it even easier for hikers and to prevent them from getting lost. as well as water stations. There are also trail markers at regular intervals. These markers give the coordinates of the marker using the HK 1980 grid system. This grid system is well known in Hong Kong and even sometimes used by police over addresses because it's so easy to use and ingrained in society. As well as this, additional cell towers were placed in and around the area to make sure people on the trail could always get good service. The measures seemed to be working, and up until 2005, there didn't seem to be anything too unusual happening on the trail. Like in all parks and wilderness areas, there would be the occasional call for lost hikers or accidents on the trails, but it wasn't anything that wouldn't have been seen anywhere else in the world. Starting in September of 2005, strange things began to happen. It started with an off-duty policeman named Ding Liwa. Ding was a high-ranking officer working on an anti-triad operation, but on September 11th, 2005, he had the day off. He decided to go hiking and set off into the park alone. He quickly found himself lost, even though he was still on the trail, and he contacted emergency services for help. He sounded panicked, but was able to give the dispatcher his coordinates. He repeated the coordinates multiple times and was certain that he had gotten them correct. They looked like ordinary coordinates, and the dispatcher didn't think anything of it when she handed them to the search and rescue team. After roughly a 7-minute call, the line dropped. Ding wouldn't answer the phone again. Search and rescue teams set out for the coordinates, but quickly found that they didn't correspond to anywhere. Even though they looked right, the coordinates didn't actually exist. A search was conducted in the area where Ding is believed to have been, but no trace of him was found. Ding wouldn't be the only person to disappear in that park that year, though. Roughly a month later, a scout leader and a group of women were on a hiking trip near where Ding had disappeared. The scout leader was an experienced hiker, having been to Sai Kung Park almost every week. He regularly took out less experienced hikers, like the women in his group. During the trip, the young man started to feel ill. The group paused for a rest near the spot where Ding was last believed to have been. The man told his companions he was going to rest for a little longer and that they should go on ahead. He figured he would be able to catch up with them when he was feeling a little better. The women left, but when their guide didn't catch up, they grew concerned. They contacted the police the same day, and an intensive search operation took place. But again, there was no sign of the missing person. It wouldn't be until 2 days later that the man's body was found. He was located just off the trail in an area that was well searched. It was also one of the most popular hiking spots. It seemed impossible that the man had been there all that time with nobody noticing him. There were many other similar incidents throughout the following months and years, with people disappearing never to be seen again, or being found days later in places where they had already searched. Then in 2016, a missing person came back alive. Zhang Shenpeng had gone hiking alone on June 18, 2016. He planned to only be away for the day and didn't pack anything for an overnight trip or even a light. When his friends couldn't get in touch with him the following day, he was reported missing and a search took place. 4 days and 3 nights passed with no sign of Zhang. Then he reappeared apparently out of nowhere. A friend had been part of the search team but wandered away from the main group without thinking about where he was going. When he realized how far he had walked, he turned to head back to the group, and suddenly he heard someone calling his name and spotted Zhang. Zhang would claim to have been lost on the trail for the duration of his disappearance. He told a strange story about mysteriously fainting and waking up somewhere that he didn't recognize. He tried to make his way back but was disoriented. A few times he spotted other people, but they would disappear before he could reach them or walk past him, apparently not even noticing him. Some believe Zhang temporarily traveled to another dimension, while others claim the whole thing was a hoax. The only thing we know for certain is that something terrifying is going on in these trails, but no one knows what it may be. Number 2. Road ghosts are some of the most popular ghost stories around the world. It seems like almost every country has at least one stretch of road where not all the travelers are alive. Sometimes the paranormal activity stretches to the cars themselves, suddenly stopping for no reason or having the electronic systems break. There are few roads with as many ghost stories as a stretch of road in Lincolnshire, England. It's here that the so-called Ruskington Terror lurks. The Ruskington Terror first came into the public eye in 1998, when a daytime TV show asked viewers to phone in with their experiences of the paranormal. One of the first callers was a man named Kevin Whelan, who lived in a small town near the village of Ruskington. His creepy story inspired other callers who had experienced something similar. Kevin's encounter took place in January of 1988. He was driving along the A15 motorway about 2 a.m., a completely ordinary trip for him. As he passed the turnoff for Ruskington, something terrifying appeared. There was something white in the middle of the road. At first, it looked like a plastic bag, but as he got closer, it was clear that wasn't the case. It was some kind of light in a humanoid shape, with one hand held out as if to indicate to stop. A face appeared around the car's front pillar, on top of the windshield. It had dark hair and olive-colored skin. Its face was pitted, and the image was so clear Kevin could make out its teeth. Kevin continued to drive at about 60 miles per hour, completely terrified. The face stayed in the window for 40 or 50 seconds before Kevin went through a small dip in the road and the ghost disappeared. The story intrigued the host of the program, presenter Richard Madeley, and other viewers began to call in with similar stories from the same turnoff to Ruskington. Another caller named Bob Burkett described driving down the same stretch of road at about 8:30 at night, only to be met by the same figure with his hand outstretched. The program received so many calls that the show returned to the segment the following day. This time, they traveled to Ruskington. There was no paranormal activity on the show itself, but plenty of people who had experienced things they could not explain. Most of the stories fell into two categories. There's the white figure that stands in the road, apparently trying to warn people to stop and go no further. But there were other ghosts that would not just stand back and watch the cars drive past. Multiple witnesses reported seeing something dart out in front of their car when they were driving too fast to stop. The figure was human-shaped and usually dark, rather than the white figure that stood in the road. Drivers never felt themselves hit anything, but they were sure that their cars must have struck whatever it was that jumped out in front of them. Every time, if the driver stopped to look for what they had hit, they would be unable to find anything. During the show, a self-professed psychic cleansed the road, believing that would stop whatever paranormal activity was plaguing drivers. But later investigations showed that the Ruskington horror is still out there, and terrifying people to this day. One story is that of a taxi driver who was driving through the area in the early hours of the morning one day in 2004. As she passed the Ruskington turnoff, something jumped out in front of her car. Like the other witnesses to the paranormal activity, she saw nothing when she got out, but she was certain that she had hit something. She called her office, who contacted the police. The police searched the surrounding area in case whoever or whatever the woman had seen was still there, but they found nothing. The woman was so shaken that she refused to get back behind the wheel and had to be taken home in a police car. The Ruskington horror doesn't only attack people in cars. There are at least 2 stories of people encountering the paranormal on foot. One story was encountered by the daughter of a man who had experienced the incident. He had been stationed at RAF Cranwell, a base near Ruskington. One night, he and a group of 4 other airmen were walking back to the base and decided to cut across one of the fields beside the road, as it would be much quicker. As they walked, the pale figure appeared. Again, it held its hand out to indicate to stop. The men had watched the figure appear out of nowhere and decided that it was better to do what it said. They turned back and rejoined the road to walk back to the base. Another story came from Charlie Connolly. Charlie is a nonfiction writer and broadcaster and was researching a book about British and Irish history when he encountered something strange. He was walking along the A15, taking a similar route to that of King Harold on his march from Stamford Bridge to Hastings in 1066. As he walked, he suddenly found there was no traffic around. The only other people around were a pedestrian couple walking towards him. It was a man and a woman, dressed in clothes suited to much warmer temperatures than the cool night that Charlie was experiencing. As they crossed paths, Charlie said hello to them but got no response. The couple continued on walking. Charlie also took a few more steps forward before turning around to ask if everything was all right. When he turned to them, they were nowhere to be found. It was only after the event that Charlie learned of the haunting experiences of people in the area and the Ruskington Terror. There have been many explanations for this strange phenomenon put forward, but none have been confirmed. Normally, hauntings along a stretch of road can be explained by one tragic event, but this haunting was so out of the ordinary that a singular incident didn't seem to be the explanation. There have been some tragic events near the Ruskington horror location. During the war, an RAF plane came down in the area. A few years later, a hermit lost his life on the road. In more recent years, there was also a tragic motorcycle accident. But paranormal experts do not believe any of those are responsible for the strange events. One explanation could lie in a village that's only a few hundred meters away from the site of the events. Dunsby is one of several abandoned medieval villages in Lincolnshire. Most were depopulated during the Black Death, and there's supposedly a plague pit buried beneath one of the nearby fields. The figure could be warning visitors not to go near the homes of people with the disease, not realizing that they passed away hundreds of years ago. Also nearby are the remains of one of the few Knights Templar churches in the UK. The mysterious organization is often connected to the occult, and it's possible some of their work lingered in the area long after the Knights disappeared. There are more mundane explanations, though. The area surrounding the turnoff to Ruskington is incredibly flat, with nothing but fields for miles. Some have suggested that this mundanity tricks the brain into creating apparitions in order to stay awake. The apparitions disappear as soon as the person is focused on the present again, and they're left confused about what they saw. However the Ruskington horror came to be, it still lies in wait near the turnoff to the quiet village, waiting for its next victim. Number 1. The Dag poltergeist is one of the strangest unsolved hauntings in history. The ghost tormented a family for 3 months before presenting itself as an angelic creature and disappearing into the sky. The haunting took place in 1889. George Dag was a farmer living in Clarendon, near Shawville, Quebec. He and his wife Susan had 3 young children and had an adopted daughter from Scotland named Dinah. The activity started on September 15th with the disappearance of 2 banknotes. George handed his wife a $5 bill and a $2 bill and told her to put both in a drawer, which she did. Later that day, a boy named Dean, who did chores about the house, came to George and said he found the $5 bill beside the stove. George accused him of stealing, which appeared to be confirmed when the $2 bill was found in his bedsheets. Dean was discharged and the paranormal activity began in earnest. The haunting started out with typical poltergeist activity. Objects were thrown about the room or out of rooms that had nobody in them. On one occasion, a spinning wheel was entirely dismantled and separate parts were put in different parts of the house. A mouth organ was played by an invisible force, and animal mess was spread across the kitchen floor. At first, Dean was accused of the mischief, but when it continued to happen, even when Dean was being watched, it was obvious that there was something else behind the paranormal activity. On one occasion, stones were thrown through the window, breaking almost every pane of glass in the house. John Dag, George's father, hid himself outside the house to try to catch the prankster. He watched as the glass continued to break without anybody else present. The strange activity attracted the attention of other farmers in the area. George was well respected, and so much so that he would later be elected mayor. But the haunting would still be too much to be believed if the neighboring farmers didn't watch it happen themselves. They would later sign a written statement attesting to all the activity they had witnessed. That included fires mysteriously being set. According to the statement, as many as 8 fires in one day appeared out of nowhere. The sights varied from the curtains, then Susan Dag's bed, to locations in the yard. They were all swiftly put out, and no explanation could ever be found. The focus on the activity appeared to be on Dinah. She was the first person to see the creature. One night, she and her grandmother were in a bedroom when she was asked what the black thing was that was pulling off the bedclothes. The elderly woman couldn't see the creature but did see the bedclothes floating in midair. The creature only showed itself to children. It took many different forms, including a man with a cow's head, horns, and hooves, and later a large black dog. Every time the children saw it, it remained invisible to the adults. The haunting caught the attention of a man named Percy Woodcock. Woodcock was described as an artist, a journalist, and a student of psychology. He was also something of a paranormal investigator. He came to the Dagg home to witness the haunting and to try to get to the bottom of whatever was causing it. He discovered that the creature would actually talk, at least when Dinah was present. It first made itself heard in the woodshed, but then came to the main house. Woodcock and the creature talked on and off for roughly 5 hours. They debated philosophy, theology, and morals. According to a newspaper report from the time, it used language unfit for polite ears and was quite rude. This wasn't the only time that the creature spoke. On another occasion, it told a priest that had come to exorcise the home that he should stick to photography. The creature made it clear that it was aware of everything that was going on in the Dagg home, and in the neighboring homes. It also identified itself, though that identity changed multiple times. It called itself a devil, the devil, and a spirit of a man who passed away 20 years earlier at the age of 80. None of those identities could explain what was going on at the Dagg family home. The answer seemed to be clear as time went on, though. As it got more and more attention, the demeanor of the entity started to change. It grew less hostile and wanted to perform for visitors instead. Its voice changed from the gruff, rude tones to something more pleasant. It even joined in singing hymns. Towards the end of its stay, it presented itself to the child as a man with a beautiful voice and long white hair, wearing a crown with stars on it. It claimed it was an angelic being, though the Daggs found this hard to believe. Finally, on November 18th, the children came running in from where they had gone to draw water from the well. They claimed the creature had told them goodbye before flying up into the air, leaving behind a line of fire. The paranormal activity stopped, and the strange entity was never seen or heard from again. There are countless theories about this strange and creepy haunting, and conflicting accounts of events. One source claims that George Dagg went to a woman called the Witch of Plum Hollow for advice early in the haunting. She told him that a neighboring widow with 2 sons was practicing dark magic and targeting Dinah. The only woman that matched that description was Mrs. Wallace, who had no problems with any of the Dagg household and couldn't explain what was going on. Later, Dinah was accused of being behind the haunting. It was declared a hoax, and people claimed that Dinah was simply a master ventriloquist. But that didn't explain all the mysterious activity that had been seen by more than a dozen members of the community. But it was explained in another theory. One newspaper report claimed that the Daggs were engaged in a land dispute with Mrs. Wallace and had concocted the whole haunting to try to frame her for it. This theory doesn't seem to have taken hold in the community, as the Daggs were clearly trusted even after this point. What happened to Dinah remains a mystery. She disappears from the historical record, though the rest of the Dagg children do not. Thomas Dagg, the youngest of the Dagg children, claimed that he had been at their uncle's house when a stranger came with a note signed by their father, telling Dinah to come home. Dinah left with the stranger never to be seen again. Another newspaper article claimed that the paranormal activity started when a traveler came to the Dagg home and asked to take Dinah away. When the Daggs refused, the activity started. This paranormal activity will likely never be solved. After November 18th, the paranormal activity completely stopped. The house still exists today. The current owners claim to have heard doors closing by themselves and strange scratching sounds in the attic over the oldest parts of the house, but it doesn't appear that the Dagg poltergeist has returned. The creature had its fun, received the attention that it wanted, and disappeared to wherever it had come from. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.